60 years ago, state troopers beat women and children who marched for the right to vote.
I thought they were killing the people down front.
And African Americans must take outlandish tests just to register to vote.
On occasion, they were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar.
And now we've moved from that to an age in which young voters may not even believe such things could have ever happened.
It bothers me that our kids today do not know how freedom was won and what the cost of that freedom was.
This is the story of how courageous students drove change.
They were ready to die for the right to vote.
I'm Craig Patrick, and for the next half hour, we'll explain the push for voting rights from those who led it.
We'll start in North Alabama in the spring of '63 on America's path to equality. Birmingham, Alabama, May 3rd, 1963. Students peacefully protest racial segregation, and police attack them with fire hoses and dogs right in front of the press. This photo spreads in newspapers around the world, and it revolts much of the nation and inspires Congress to draft the Civil Rights Act. But segregationists stall it in the Senate.
We shall resist until the end.
St. Augustine, Florida, June 18, 1964. A motel owner pours acid in a pool with black and white swimmers. It shocks the nation's conscience again, breaks the Senate filibuster, and compels Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act.
St. Augustine might well pave the way for a new century of freedom for all.
It does, and that path to freedom leads from Florida back to Alabama, where Jeff Drew picks up the story.
Kids today don't know the cost of freedom.
Jeff Drew grew up in Birmingham, Alabama's Dynamite Hill, so named for hundreds of terrorist bombings by the Klan.
And we could feel the effects of the blast through the rock, and it would actually lift us off the floor.
His parents built this brick wall around their home to protect them from bombs and bullets, and to help conceal their secret house guest, Dr. Martin Luther King.
Mom would pick him up at the airport, no press. He would slip in and out of his house as needed.
This is where King planned the campaign to take down segregation, and as the next leap, empower African Americans to vote. While the Civil Rights Act required restaurants and hotels to serve blacks, it did not remove the barriers to voting. And the white supremacists who ruled the South required blacks to pay an extra tax called a poll tax and pass a so-called literacy test.
The poll tax exam required the people to know how many windows there were in the courthouse, how many steps there were on the northern entrance to the courthouse. There were absolutely asinine questions being given to register to vote that no one could ever answer those questions correctly.
The test varied from county to county and state to state. An aspiring voter might have to print the word vote upside down in correct order, or draw a square divided in half from northeast to southwest, then divided with a broken line from midwest to mideast, and write right from the left to the right, while bisecting verticals with curved horizontals, or know where the Constitution dictates original jurisdiction when the state is party to a case. And if they missed anything, they flunked.
We actually had classes where we would teach potential voters how to pass the poll tax exam. I mean, it was a horrible voter registration campaign because they Birmingham and Alabama didn't really want you to be registered to vote.
As an experiment, a Duke University law professor sent Alabama's literacy test to 96 constitutional law professors across the nation, and they all failed. By the way, people were exempt from taking the test if they had a grandfather or ancestor who was eligible to vote before 1870. That's how the term grandfather clause got started. And it's the loophole that exempted whites from taking the tests because whites were eligible to vote before 1870 while blacks were not.
It was all kind of stumbling blocks to keep you from registering to vote.
Richard Smiley spent most of his life in Tampa, but in the 1960s he was living in a foster home around 90 miles south of Birmingham in a small town called Selma. A civil rights activist came to town and changed his life.
A gentleman by the name of Bernard Lafayette was in Selma organizing, and we was marching.
Bernard Lafayette was born and raised in Tampa. He became one of the original freedom riders who defied segregation in public busing, was beaten for it, and sent to Mississippi's notorious Parchman Prison in 1961. And after Lafayette was freed, he traveled to Selma. He helped launch the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee called SNCC, which inspired students like Richard and sparked the Selma movement.
I used to go to jail every day. Every day.
The sheriff kept sending him and others to jail because they kept showing up at the courthouse asking to vote.
I just believe all my life that I believe in standing up for right.
As the Selma campaign picked up, Dr. King and the students some 90 miles north in Birmingham took notice. For context, in 1963, they had succeeded in Birmingham in part because they had the perfect foil in ruthless police boss Bull Connor.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
Law and order had taken a back seat. Bull Connor was the perfect model. He didn't know it at the time, but he was the perfect model for our campaign.
Then in 1964, King and the activists succeeded in St. Augustine, in part because they had the perfect foil in motel owner James Brock and his jugs of acid. So as they watched the student protest in Selma, and they saw Sheriff James Clark pushing, prodding, and jabbing nonviolent demonstrators.
Believe me, there were those that followed Hitler like you blindly follow this Sheriff Clark, who didn't think their day would come.
They knew they had found the perfect foil yet again in 1965, even before the sheriff hit civil rights leader C.T. Vivian in the face.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street.
Dr. King's movement and the SNCC movement joined forces to turn the national spotlight to Selma and the tactics of Sheriff Clark.
And everybody in the white power structure of this city must take a responsibility for everything that Jim Clark does in this community.
Then on February 18th, a deacon named Jimmy Lee Jackson was trying to protect his mother from a police beating when a state trooper shot and killed him. Well, that inspired them to speed up their plans to March 7th, with a cold 50-mile march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, which would lead to a fateful, bloody clash with the forces of Sheriff Clark and the forces of segregationist Governor George Wallace.
There will be no march between Selma, Alabama, and Montgomery, and I have so instructed the Department of Public Safety.
And that leads to one of the most shameful days in our nation's history. Coming up, the inside story of Bloody Sunday, the fallout, and the comeback.
This is a foot soldier breakfast.
Richard Smiley is a retired Tampa professor and an expert on the civil rights battle of Selma.
I think Selma is the foundation.
And he can teach us more about that than he ever cared to learn.
Once you get your head beat and busted, you committed.
As a child, Smiley moved from Bradenton to a foster home in Selma, Alabama, at its moment of truth.
Now you better move these people out of here.
The white supremacists who run this town versus the black students who peacefully resist.
Do you believe in equal justice for all?
I believe in justice.
Do you believe in equal justice?
I don't believe in equal nothing. There's no two people in this world alike, and they are not equal on any terms or conditions.
They were ready to die for the right to vote.
On paper, it looks as if blacks can vote. But this southern town, like so many others, put up so many obstacles, most can't do it.
The Board of Registrars is not in session this afternoon, as you were informed.
In 1960, nearly half of Selma's population is black, but less than 1% in Selma's Dallas County succeed in registering to vote.
A lot of whites didn't believe in all that stuff that was happening in Selma, but they couldn't speak out.
And why didn't they stand up to it if they believed something different?
That would have been very dangerous for them to stand up.
Why?
They could have got killed. They could lose their home. Everything that happened to us could happen to them, and worse.
So when the famed freedom rider and Tampa native Bernard Lafayette comes to Selma, and he organizes peaceful protests for voting rights, Richard Smiley finds his calling.
The victory is right around the corner.
And when Bernard Lafayette joins forces with Dr. King, and they announce plans to put Selma in the national spotlight with a march to Montgomery, Richard finds yet another obstacle in his path, this one from his social worker.
She advised me that if I walked from Selma to Montgomery, that I would be kicked out of my foster home.
He describes her as one of the many who didn't really want that, but did not object.
I don't think she had a racist heart. I just think she had a concern for her and her job. I understand her job, but I had a moral obligation to march from Selma to Montgomery. That was part of the sacrifice. That's how much it meant to me.
The foster system tries to discourage him by questioning his sanity.
They even sent me to psychologists. I had to have all those tests, those block tests and all that.
And to his point about a lot of white people not believing in all this stuff, guess what happens next?
But the amazing thing about the psychologist, he shared with me, he said, look, nothing wrong with you. You need to continue to fight for your people.
That leads him and around 600 others to America's climactic battle for voting rights.
It was an overcast day. It was cold.
Dr. King's group, the SCLC, sends Hosea Williams, who had helped ignite the St. Augustine movement the year before. And Lafayette's group called SNCC sends its chairman, a 25-year-old freedom rider there in the light trench coat. His name is John Lewis. Williams and Lewis lead the march. And Richard Smiley is near the front, 16th in line. He's also 16 years old.
We don't know what's going to happen this day. Now, we've been to jail, we've been beat, but this was a different day. This created some, our knees was knocking.
That we will not surrender our system of government.
Segregationist Governor George Wallace said they won't make it and said his enforcers would see to it. And there they are, waiting around a mile and a half away on the other side of the Alabama River. Richard sees them in the middle of the street as they cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which incidentally is named after a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan.
We saw about 150, 200 state troopers with gas masks on.
And they see the sheriff's posse riding along the sides of the road.
These were white guys just hated blacks. They was on horses with billy clubs and cattle prods. They were deputized by the sheriff.
The governor's forces make the first move.
And once we crossed the bridge, the state trooper told us that march was illegal.
To be detrimental to your safety to continue this march.
They give the marchers a 2-minute warning to disperse. Then, about 1 minute later, they attack. Students near the back of the line hear loud pops they assume are bullets. Here's one right there. And another there.
I thought they were killing the people down front because that's the first thing we heard.
The sounds are not bullets, but rather caps popping off of canisters of tear gas. We see troopers push a woman to the ground. And then tear gas hides much of the beatings to come. We can see wailing clubs along the edges of the smoke. We see a masked silhouette slapping at one who slips away. And we see that light trench coat on the ground. That's future Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis collapsing as a trooper fractures his skull.
I could hear John Lewis' head get beat. And when I realized I was so close, I said, well, I think we too close.
Richard Smiley runs, but he runs into the tear gas. There he is, dazed and gagging to the cheers of the posse.
And every time the police would throw a tear gas bomb, they would cheer.
As the victims stagger back across the bridge, the sheriff's posse follows them behind the white cloud to finish them off.
So we would beat on one side of the bridge and the other side of the bridge.
Across the rest of the nation, Americans are watching a movie on network TV.
A decision must be made in the life of every nation.
It's called Judgment at Nuremberg.
It's what it stands for when standing for something is the most difficult.
And it gets preempted, interrupted for this. These images from Selma stun the nation and drive change in Washington. President Johnson addresses a joint session of Congress and calls for what that march was all about, a Voting Rights Act.
But really, it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Back in Selma, Richard Smiley returns to his foster home and discovers he's been evicted.
My stuff was sitting on the porch.
No, Richard winds up sleeping in churches at the brink of history. Coming up, he and around 30,000 others regroup and complete their mission.
Women too battered to walk, found dazed and bleeding.
Can we have somebody take somebody to a doctor?
60 years ago, in the American South, when African Americans peacefully marched for the right to vote, and a segregationist governor orders his troopers to stop them. This is what you get.
It's difficult to talk about without getting a little bit emotional, because I have never seen that much hatred. I've never seen anything like that before in my life.
The federal government gives blacks the right to vote after the Civil War, but the southern states effectively take it away, intimidating those who line up at the courthouse and making them take ridiculous tests before they can register.
On occasion, they were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar.
That's former Congressman John Lewis before he died in 2020, on why he led the first march on March 7, 1965, that fractured his skull near the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And here's Dr. King on why they had to try again.
We have no alternative but to keep moving with determination. We've gone too far now to turn back.
2 days after the beating known as Bloody Sunday, King leads a second march, but suspends it when he sees the armed troopers and posse blocking their way.
Stand where you are.
That night, a mob finds and murders James Reeb, a white minister who had joined the march. America mourns while Dr. King seeks help in federal court. There on the left of the screen, King's top lieutenant Andrew Young arrives at a rally with news of a breakthrough. A federal judge had just ordered state troopers to stand aside for the march to resume.
We have a legal and constitutional right to march from Selma to Montgomery.
Meanwhile, President Johnson federalizes the National Guard to protect the marchers. It takes bipartisan support from a Democratic president and Republican judge to proceed.
I always point out to my Republican friends that all of the people who decided in our favor were Republicans. Every case we won across the South, it was a Republican judge.
And with a court order in place, you can guess what happens next.
Bus rides to Alabama.
Al Lingo had marched through Florida, and he was in this St. Augustine pool with black friends when the motel owner attacked them with acid. His parents want him to stop.
I could get killed, blah, 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 all that.
But he and thousands of others are drawn to Selma because it is dangerous and needs to change.
There were young people who were making something go and kind of defeating the notion that everything's really okay here. Black and white people are all pleased with the way things are.
They carry sleeping bags for a 54-mile march to the state capitol. White supremacists arrive as spectators, glaring and some spitting along the way.
The Klan was on the curb, and they were there in robes with axe handles and shotguns.
Jeff Drew is one of the runners, meaning he runs along the edge of the road.
My job and other kids my age, we were commissioned to run from the back of the bridge, from the end of the bridge all the way to the front and back, to keep the marchers from accidentally stepping on the curb. Because if they did, we could have all been killed.
Andrew Young manages the pace, and former Florida Governor Leroy Collins helps him keep people safe. Collins had denounced segregation, killed his career in state politics, and found a higher calling.
This was a new way to be the church.
I shall not be moved.
A parade of nuns, ministers, and students swells to more than 30,000 people.
We have people coming in from all over the country. I suspect that we will have representatives from almost every state in the Union.
Through 54 miles, they walk through cold rain and stop off at farms that invite them to eat and sleep.
We lived in tents on the road. We had farmers, some of the farmers would let us put up a tent.
Newsreels depict them as foot soldiers for freedom.
It is a Sunday to be remembered.
While segregationist propaganda claims they're communists.
King has amassed an amazing number of communists and Communist Front associations.
Again, the newsreels project King as a heroic leader.
Under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King.
While Alabama state government claims he's a threat.
Violence follows his footsteps, and he makes it a vital part of his program.
It's a narrative of triumph.
The long-awaited, long-delayed Freedom March to Montgomery begins.
Versus fear tactics that worked back then through much of the South.
Students in other countries have toppled democratic governments.
And this is why peaceful marchers call it the Battle of Selma.
The real struggle is a struggle for what's true.
I shall not be moved.
And they know they can prevail the farther they go and the harder they push.
It was a white guy named Jim. He didn't have but one leg. He was on crutches. Yeah, I knew him personally. He walked that whole 50 miles. When he got to Montgomery, he had calluses on his hand, big as my hand.
And as they approach the Capitol, the scene lights up like the Wizard of Oz. They happen to reach Montgomery around the same time a lot of news photographers are switching to color film. It's an unintended metaphor of their journey and of more Americans seeing beyond black and white and where it will lead.
It set a spark off.
I shall not be moved.
And it inspired Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act. And we'll show you how that changed America and closing thoughts when we come back. President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965. It banned the onerous test and other tactics that disenfranchised black voters during segregation, and it empowered voter registration drives, it expanded the electorate, and produced a new generation of African American leaders. And this program is just part of that story. You'll find our series of documentaries on the civil rights movement on the Fox Local app. Well, thank you for watching this edition of America's Path to Equality.